In this video, we will talk about how to formulate a research question for your research project. And I'm not thinking both in terms of a small research project, like the one we'll conduct in class, but also for a larger research project like your master thesis. First of all, a quick definition when it comes to the difference between a research question and a hypothesis. Because a research question is formulated as a question with a question mark and asks a question. Whereas a hypothesis is in a way the opposite, because it suggests an answer that you can then use the research to prove or disprove. In order to formulate an hypothesis, you often need some background knowledge in order to suggest an answer that's appropriate for the research, and it's more common in quantitative research projects. So in this video, we'll talk about research questions and not hypotheses. You might ask yourself, why do I need a research question, or do I need it from the beginning? I like this question from a book by Nigor called Writing for Scholars, where the author says that if you do not have a specific question in mind when you are writing, what you will end up with is just a more exotic version of an elementary school paper on tigers or any other topic. A regurgitation of everything you know about the subject in no particular order with no particular aim. So if you don't have a research question, you'll just write out everything you know about your topic in no particular order with no particular aim. And the research question narrows down the scope of your project, so it defines what is relevant to include or not. Instead of including everything on the topic, you will include what is relevant in order to answer the question. And it gives your project or your writing a direction, so that you avoid the situation of having no particular order and no particular aim. And it makes it much easier for the reader to follow your writing. Research questions, I should say, that can be revised one or several times as your research project develops. So you should start out with the research questions when you design your research project, but that research question will, in most cases, change. Sometimes it changes just a little bit. You change some of the terms in the question because you find other words that are more precise or more fitting to what you want to do. At other times, the question changes quite a lot, because as you learn more about your topic, as you start collecting data, as you read more, the focus of your project changes. And that's also totally fine. But start out with a preliminary question to give your project a direction. It's like going on a holiday, knowing at least the first destination, and then the rest can come as you go along. And in the rest of this video, we'll be talking about how to formulate good research questions, looking at 4 criteria that you can use to evaluate your own ideas for research questions or research questions that you encounter in the writing of others. First of all, and this is a very concrete criteria, is the research question formulated as a question using question words such as what, how, in what ways, which, or why? And I emphasize this because you will find in journal articles that you read or in master theses that you read that research questions are not always formulated as question words. But I find it's easier to know exactly what your research question is if it's actually formulated as a question. Because otherwise it's easy to spend several sentences trying to formulate your research question, and then each of these sentences give your project a slightly different direction. And as a reader, it's then difficult to know exactly what are you trying to do in this project. So try to formulate your research question as a question with a question word and a verb which specifies the relationship between the different parts of the research question. So for instance, human rights, peace building, migration and identity, religion, these are not research questions, these are topics, and they're also quite broad topics. There's no question word or no verb in these topics. An example of a research question, and you'll find more when you start reading the master thesis, is how do Norwegian faith-based organizations interpret their faith-based identity? So there's a question word, how. There's a subject, Norwegian faith-based organizations, and there's a verb, interpret. And finding the right question verb the question word and verb can sometimes take some time. I encourage you to try to change the question word, the verb, and see how that changes the research question. Changing from how to why, changing from one verb to another will change the focus of a research question. And if you're struggling to find out exactly what you want to find out in your research, you can play around with different question words and different verbs. The second criteria is the research question precise and sufficiently narrow? And this is in a way a simple criteria, but at the same time it's maybe the most difficult criteria to meet and to use when you're evaluating your own ideas, because I find that in my experience, master students always start with research questions that are very wide and that cover too much. And I think that's typical when you're new to a topic, you haven't read a lot, you haven't developed your ideas a lot. You might also be afraid of having enough to say in your thesis. You start wide, but then you need to narrow down the topic by pushing your ideas through what I call the research funnel. You see the image here, trakt in Norwegian. You have to push your ideas through this funnel and delimit what are you going to study, who will you study, where will you conduct the study, in order to end up with something that's more manageable. I like when I supervise students to use the image of a large jigsaw puzzle. Let's say this puzzle has 1,000 pieces. And in your research, maybe what you do is only to say something about one single piece, 1 out of 1,000 pieces. And all these 1,000 pieces are all related to your topic. And that's okay. Think depth instead of breadth. That will make your research project much more interesting. Because if you try to cover too much, it will become very superficial and not very interesting to read. And focusing your ideas often involves reading. If you do not know a lot about a topic, you cannot narrow down the scope of the topic. Then you need to read more, learn more in order to see the different aspects and nuances of your topic, in order to be able to divide your topic into different subtopics. The more you know, the more you will see that there's a lot to your topic. There's a lot of different ways of approaching the topic and a lot of different research questions within this topic. So read if you're not familiar with the topic. Read, and then as you read, start formulating research questions. Thirdly, you should think about whether the research question you formulate is actually researchable. Can you actually do the research? Can you actually answer the research question? First of all, be careful with normative research questions in an empirical research project. Or I could state it even stronger, avoid normative research questions when you're doing empirical research. There's nothing wrong with normative research questions, but in an empirical research project, you need research questions that you can answer by collecting empirical data. You need research questions that you can collect data on, not philosophical debates. So avoid questions such as how should we combat poverty? It's a very open question and it's very difficult to answer using empirical methods. It can, however, be a great starting point for a theoretical thesis in which you discuss the views of different authors on this topic, how to combat poverty. But then you're not doing empirical research. So if you are doing empirical research and that's what you plan to do, and collecting data, whether by doing interviews or observation or doing a textual analysis, ask a question such as, how do faith-based organizations work to combat poverty? Or how is poverty experienced? Both these questions can be answered using empirical research, although I would say both questions need to be further narrowed down, but at least they're empirical research questions. Because in empirical research, the research questions you ask they have to take people's actual behavior, experiences, thoughts, perceptions as their starting point. In addition, once you have that empirical question, think about practical and personal concerns that you need to take into account in order to be able to actually do the research. That it's time, money, human resources, your own skills, your own positionality. Do you need to travel outside of Oslo or outside of where you live to collect your data? Would you need then funding to do so? Do you have that money yourself? Do you need to learn a new language because you're planning to analyze texts that are written in a language you do not speak? Do you need to access a new social setting or a group? And in that case, how will your gender, age, religion, political belief, what is referred to as positionality, we'll talk more about that term later, how will your positionality make it easier or harder for you to access that social setting? Sometimes your positionality may make it impossible for you to do that research. Maybe someone else can do it, but not you. So think about that. It should be researchable. And this is also about time. Don't make a project that's too big. You only have half a year or 1 year available, depending on how many credits go into your thesis. Lastly, is the research question that you formulate informed by previous research and relevant academic literature? Because when you design a research project and formulate research questions, you also need to spend quite some time reading other people's research. And my experience is that many students find it difficult to understand how they should incorporate the academic literature in their research project. And my best advice is to start looking at how this is done in other research projects. Read previous master theses, read more than just one. Look at what kind of literature they use. Look at how they use it. Look at where in the thesis they use this literature. Read journal articles that are based on empirical research. We have some in the reading list for this course. You've probably read others for other courses. Look at how they incorporate literature. Because often when we read academic literature, we're so focused on learning the new concepts, finding out what the author discovered, what is their findings or arguments of the source, and we forget to look at how the research is conducted. What are the research methods? What kind of data is the research based on? How does the author use literature, etc.? Look at how things are done, not just what the researcher did. Because you can incorporate literature in different ways in a research project. One way, and you can do both of these ways at the same time. One way is to build on the findings from previous research. Look for related research when you design your research project. You might not find someone who has conducted exactly the same research that you plan to do, but chances are high that you will find someone who has conducted something similar, maybe in a different context, a different time, maybe focusing on a slightly different group, focusing on a different aspect of your topic. Read this research, review it, make a summary of what do we know about my topic based on this research? What is left out for me to find out? Are there any disagreements or debates about how to understand my topic in the academic literature? A second way to incorporate literature is to think about the concepts and theories that can be useful for you in order to interpret and make sense of your data. We'll talk more about the use of literature later, but one key characteristic of research, which distinguishes it from, for instance, journalism, journalists also ask questions. They're also concerned about contemporary topics. But researchers will use concepts and theories to analyze the data they have collected and relate their own arguments to discussions and debates going on in the literature. How are these concepts they use defined in the literature by other authors? Are there any discussions or disagreements on how to understand a certain concept? Any debates between different theories on how to understand a certain phenomenon, how to explain it, what kind of aspects this phenomenon has? As part of your research design, you should do a literature review where you present and discuss the concepts and theories that you are using. And these concepts and theories in the final thesis, they will be presented and discussed in the theory chapter. But even if you don't start by writing the theory chapter, literature should be part of a research from the very beginning of your research. So those were 4 criteria that will hopefully help you to evaluate the research question ideas you have and formulate good research questions. Good luck.